Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're heading over to Huntington Beach, California. There's a special election coming up, June 10th, 2025, and voters have two key things to decide on, Measure A and Measure B.
Yeah, and these measures, they really zero in on a couple of, well, pretty major debates, things that aren't just happening in Huntington Beach. You know?
Right.
We're talking about control over kids' books in the library, and also this whole question around potentially privatizing library services.
Okay. And we've looked at quite a bit of material for this, the ballot language itself, arguments from both sides, some analyses, news reports, trying to get a full picture.
It's a good mix, and like you said, it's important because what's happening there, it kind of reflects these bigger conversations about libraries that are popping up really all over the country.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
understanding Huntington Beach helps us understand that wider picture.
Mm-hmm.
And just to be clear, our goal here isn't to tell anyone how to vote. That's, up to the residents there. We just want to unpack these measures, look at the different arguments from the sources, and really try to get a handle on what the core issues are for the community.
Sounds good. Where should we start? Measure A.
Yeah, let's dive into Measure A first. This one is about the Community Parent Guardian Review Board for Procurement of Children's Library Materials. Bit of a mouthful.
It is. And to understand what a yes or no vote means, you kind of have to know the backstory. There's actually already an ordinance that, on paper at least, created this 21-member board.
Right, I saw that. The idea was for this board to review children's books, specifically looking for sexual content, before the library bought them or before kids could access them without a parent around.
Exactly. And each council member gets to appoint two people to it.
And a really key detail here, our sources say the board's decisions were supposed to be final, like no appeals process.
Yeah, that's a big point, final say. But there's a catch. This board, it hasn't actually been formed yet. It's held up because of a lawsuit.
Ah, okay. So it exists in theory, but not in practice because of legal challenges. That definitely complicates things.
It does.
So bearing that in mind, a yes vote on Measure A would basically scrap this review board idea altogether.
Right. It eliminates the board, but it also does more. It puts new policies in place for how library materials are chosen and accessed.
And who's primarily responsible under those new policies?
That would fall mainly to the Director of Community and Library Services.
Okay.
And the sources emphasize these policies, frame the library as a place for, voluntary inquiry, diverse viewpoints.
Okay.
And they explicitly prohibit excluding materials based on the author's background or views or because of the ideas in the book itself.
Okay, so that's what happens if Measure A passes. Let's look at the arguments. Why vote yes? What's the core reasoning?
Well, the main thrust for the yes vote is about protecting parents' rights to guide their own children's reading.
Ah, so individual parental rights versus a community board's decision.
Exactly. Supporters argue it's a parent's job, not politicians. They see this proposed board as basically political appointees, maybe without library training.
Who they fear just want to ban books or silence certain ideas.
Right. They contrast that with experienced librarians, and they also bring up the First Amendment, arguing book bans harm those rights.
Makes sense.
Plus, they point out, obscenity is already illegal, librarians are trained to pick age-appropriate stuff, and there's already a process if someone wants to challenge a book.
So multiple layers to their argument.
Yeah. So for them, a yes vote repeals this, potentially problematic political committee and ensures access to a wide range of information, which they see as crucial for critical thinking.
And there are quite a few notable people supporting this view.
Yes, the sources list PTA presidents, librarians, retired teachers, a pediatrician, school district officials, quite a coalition.
Okay, that paints a clear picture of the yes side.
Yeah.
Now, what about the arguments for voting no on Measure A? Why keep the possibility of this board?
The No campaign really emphasizes public input and community oversight. They see the review board as a safeguard.
A safeguard against?
Against what they term lewd or pornographic content reaching children through the library. They argue getting rid of the board concentrates too much power in one person, the director, who isn't elected.
So it's community control versus professional control, in a way.
That's a good way to put it. The no side is really focused on preserving parental control through this community voice.
Okay.
And they also push back on the book ban idea. They argue the existing ordinance isn't about banning, it's about potentially relocating materials if the board deems them inappropriate for, say, the open children's section.
So moving things, not removing them entirely.
That's their framing.
Yeah.
It's about community values, community choice, local tax dollars funding the library, that kind of argument.
And the opposition also has prominent supporters.
Yes, the mayor, a councilwoman, the mayor pro tem are listed as opposing Measure A.
Now, this whole thing seems to have gotten pretty heated. The sources mention those signs. Protect our kids from porn, no, on A and B. That's strong language.
Very strong. And it's definitely caused a backlash. Some parents were really upset, saying it forced uncomfortable conversations with their young kids who saw the signs and asked,
What's porn? Yeah, you can absolutely see why that would be upsetting for a parent.
Exactly. And then the council member, whose committee partly funded the signs, doubled down, didn't they?
Yeah, defended them by claiming there is legitimate pornography in the kids section. Even gave some pretty graphic examples according to the reports.
Which is, of course, a very serious accusation.
And directly contradicts the yes side, who insists there's no porn in the library and call the signs a disinformation campaign.
Right. It highlights this fundamental disagreement over what materials are actually present and how they should be characterized. It really gets into definitions, doesn't it?
It does. And we should also mention the ACLU and the First Amendment Coalition are involved, too. There's that lawsuit challenging the existing restricted section.
Yeah, that lawsuit is still ongoing, adding another layer of legal complexity to the whole situation around Measure A.
Okay, clearly a lot to unpack with Measure A. Let's shift now to Measure B. This one's about keeping library operations public, right?
Essentially, yes. It's about potential privatization. Yes vote on Measure B would put some pretty significant restrictions on the city's ability to sell, lease, transfer, or outsource the management of the public libraries.
So making it harder for the city to hand over library operations to a private company. What kind of hurdles would it put in place?
Well, under Measure B, the city could really only do that under specific circumstances. Like they'd need to declare a fiscal emergency.
Okay.
And get approval from both the city council and a majority of voters in an election.
Wow, so council approval plus a public vote. That's a high bar.
It is. There's also an exception if a service was already outsourced sometime between 2018 and early 2024. But generally, yes, it makes privatization much more difficult.
All right, so why are people advocating for this? What are the arguments for voting yes on B?
The Yes campaign focuses heavily on keeping libraries public, arguing residents should have the final say on something as significant as privatization. They talk about libraries as these cherished community hubs,
More than just books, community centers, resource centers.
Exactly. Educational resources, career help, all that. They also frame it as preventing politicians from potentially steering tax dollars towards corporate donors via privatization contracts.
So concerns about potential misuse of funds or political favoritism?
That's part of the argument.
Yeah.
It's also framed as limiting government overreach and preventing potential corruption. And interestingly, they bring up the city's current budget deficit, sort of questioning the fiscal arguments made by the other side.
And who's backing this side?
Sources mention school district trustees, a local pastor, an attorney, a businesswoman, and the president of the Friends of the Library group.
Okay, so the yes side wants strong public control, voter approval for privatization. What's the argument against Measure B? Why vote no?
The no side frames their argument around protecting taxpayers and maintaining the city's fiscal integrity. They argue Measure B ties the city council's hands too much.
How so?
They believe the council needs flexibility to manage city services, including the library, especially if there are budget problems. They claim Measure B kind of exempts the library from normal council oversight.
Which they worry could lead to its own budget issues down the road.
Right. So for them, it's about the council retaining the power to manage the city effectively and prevent budget crises, which might, in difficult times, involve looking at different service models for the library.
So fiscal responsibility and management flexibility are the key words there.
Pretty much. And they also use the term power grab, suggesting special interests are behind Measure B.
And the opponents are the same key figures who oppose Measure A.
Yes, the mayor, the councilwoman, and the mayor pro tem are also listed as opposing Measure B.
And didn't the council look into privatization before?
They did, yes. That's important context. They explored it previously, but backed off after, well, significant public backlash.
Ah, so that history likely fueled the push for Measure B to prevent it from coming up again easily.
Seems very likely, yeah. It set the stage for this measure.
Okay, stepping back a bit now, how does all this local Huntington Beach stuff fit into the, the bigger national picture regarding libraries.
Well, it fits very neatly, actually. These local fights really mirror national trends. We're seeing these intense political and cultural battles over libraries everywhere, efforts to censor books, challenges to funding, attempts to put libraries under tighter political control.
Yeah, we've definitely seen reports about groups like Moms for Liberty getting involved elsewhere. And that rhetoric, the groomer accusations directed at librarians, has that surfaced here too.
The sources suggest similar language and themes are definitely part of the conversation in Huntington Beach, unfortunately. It connects to that broader pattern.
And some observers feel this isn't just about a few specific books, right? It's more fundamental.
Yeah, the view is that it's often really about control. Who gets to filter information, especially for kids and teens? Who decides what perspectives are acceptable in a public space?
And Huntington Beach is being watched nationally because of this, as sort of a test case for using ballot measures in these library fights.
Exactly. People are watching to see how effective this approach is, although it's worth noting.
Yes.
Our sources mentioned that nationally, library ballot measures actually saw a bit of a dip in success rates in 2024 compared to before. So there might be growing opposition or maybe just more organized opposition in some places.
Interesting. So the Huntington Beach outcome could tell us something about the current climate for libraries facing these kinds of pressures.
Absolutely. I mean, these two measures, A and B, they represent really fundamental choices for the community there. It's about local governance, parental rights, intellectual freedom, the very future of their libraries.
And it's definitely not simple. As we've seen, there are complex arguments on both sides for both measures. Understanding those nuances is pretty crucial for anyone voting.
It really is. And, even for those of us outside Huntington Beach, watching this unfold is important. It reflects these broader societal tensions about education, information access, local control, things that are playing out everywhere.
Yeah, these aren't isolated issues. They touch on really core questions about community values in public institutions.
Right.
So maybe the final thought to leave listeners with is this. What does this intense debate in Huntington Beach truly tell us about how the role of public libraries is changing here in the 21st century? And maybe more importantly, how do we navigate the challenge of balancing all these different deeply held community values when it comes to these shared public spaces? Definitely something worth pondering.